Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this online workshop on an introduction to anonymization techniques for social science research data. My name is Maureen Haker. I've been working with the UK Data Service for over 10 years on everything from ingesting new collections, answering queries. My area of specialism is in qualitative data, and I am going to be talking about qualitative data a little bit today, but also numerical data. Okay, so this is the format of our session for today. So we have there's a structured presentation where I'm gonna go through different anonymization techniques, some practical examples, some key considerations for you. Interspersed throughout that, we have a Mentimeter, which I've embedded in the PowerPoint, and I hope it all works according to plan. So we'll kind of see how it goes as we go along. But the Mentimeter is to try and help you get thinking about some of those concepts I'm going to be talking about. And then we also have a Padlet for a Q&A, which hopefully my colleague Emma Green, who is facilitating this morning, will pop into the chat in just a moment. So you can post your question in our Q&A box, no problem at all. We also have a Padlet that I'm going to keep live for another couple of days after the workshop. So if you have a question that comes up later, feel free to go to that Padlet, pop the question in there. And what I'll do then is I'll collate all of the questions between the Zoom Q&A and the Padlet and come up with a kind of central document that we'll post alongside the slides and the recording on the events page. So the idea is for that Q&A to be an additional resource for the workshop. Okay, so here we go. Let's start out with an attempt at Menti. So what I would like for you to do, if you could, is go to menti.com and use the code 52645595, and hopefully it will take you to a oh, look, we've got some people already joining. That's fantastic. I think that is a promising sign that it's working. So this is the Menti that we're going to be using throughout the presentation. So if you do keep that open just in the background, there'll be a few more questions throughout. We've got a couple more questions now, but then throughout we'll keep coming back to this Menti. So if you want to just keep it open, when I progress to the slide, it should pop up the next question. But we just have a quick question here about what are the first words that come to mind when thinking about anonymization. And we've got privacy and security coming in top, and protection coming in top, which is fantastic. Confidentiality. There's also some interesting things. They keep moving, so I can't see where it went. But somebody said something about removing prejudice as well, which is interesting. We've got sensitive data, sharing data is coming up. Pseudonyms is coming up. Excellent. All right, we're going to move on to the next slide. I think we're all in the right place here, though. These are all, I think, going to be words that we are mentioning today. Even somebody's written in Presidio, which I will mention toward the end as well. Excellent. And our next slide, what is the most sensitive type of data you work with? So I myself have done research using biographical narrative interview method. So these are long life history interviews, which can be quite sensitive, not only in the topics that come up, but also the kinds of things that they talk about, the kinds of identifiers they reveal. So I would say I work with potentially quite sensitive data. But we've also got people working with medical history, very sensitive, children's mental health, personal data. So we'll talk about what personal data is, just to make sure everyone's all on the same page. We've got care experiences, demographic data. Yeah, a lot of people collect demographic data as a standard, and we don't often think about the sensitivity, especially if you combine some of those variables. Fantastic. Ethnographic data, very detailed. Qual data tends to be quite detailed. Excellent. So we've got quite the range that people are working with here. And one more question here. How confident are you in understanding anonymization. So we've got a lovely bell curve here. We've got moderately confident, couple of people not at all confident, or conversely very confident. It's a nice little bell curve we've got going here. Okay, so hopefully going through some things today, even if you've had some training already or a little bit of background, hopefully this will just kind of either reinforce what you already know and give you a little bit more confidence, or if it's something that you haven't encountered at all, we can give you a bit of background here as a launch pad for exploring this a bit more. Okay, so what I'm planning on doing today is to give you a bit of background on anonymization, why it's important, what's some theoretical underpinning, what are the legal responsibilities. And all of this will be done in consideration to the wider context of data sharing. And bearing in mind that, we use this three-prong approach to protecting participants and sharing data, and I'll go through what that is. Our main focus is on identifiers, and we'll have another short exercise using Mentimeter to kind of check in on how you're thinking about some of those. And then we'll touch on effective anonymization and practical considerations, including common indirect identifiers in data, either of qualitative or quantitative nature. Then we have another short Mentimeter exercise to revisit that information and hopefully spark a bit of discussion or questions. And then we'll follow up with some anonymization techniques and considerations for both quantitative and qualitative data. And then we'll end with another Mentimeter followed by a Q&A session. So anonymization, let's just jump right into it. Anonymization is a valuable tool that allows for data to be shared while preserving privacy. So every data source is different, and a number of factors need to be considered, such as the different types of data, different types of identifiers that you need to be aware of, as well as different types of disclosiveness that one can aim for. So just to emphasize here, assessment of risk of disclosure and subsequent anonymization should be something that's iterative. It's not linear. There's no single point where this should be assessed. Rather, you should think about all the places that data are going to be stored or presented. So for example, the risk of publishing with data extracts should be considered alongside, for example, sharing data with colleagues across institutions, or even just storing the data on a computer. So this session is aiming to give you a better understanding of what to look out for and why, along with different techniques and options that are available. We are also keen to ensure that researchers understand that data and anonymization techniques do not exist in isolation, and that ethical considerations such as informed consent, confidentiality and withdrawal rights, as well as clear data sharing strategies. So for example, access control, user agreements, data security, that all of these are things that are considered thoroughly. Additionally, I want to note that the information that is presented here is influenced by and aligned with current UK legislation as of May 2025. And I'm going to be presenting terms and concepts that are used by the UK Data Service. There have been some changes that are passed, even within the UK context since then, and that includes the Data Use and Access Act, the DUAA, which received royal assent in June 2025. However, guidance on those changes are not expected to be published until winter of 2025-2026. So the ICO stated that they are in a state of drafting that guidance. They are going through a consultation period on it, and the final versions are going to be due out, within the coming months. At the end of this session, I'm going to include a few more details about what to keep an eye out for as they publish that guidance, which is my cliffhanger here to kind of keep you going all the way to the end of the workshop. But I did want to acknowledge that more guidance is coming. We will go through anonymization as we teach it now, and this is still relevant. I don't think the DUAA is going to massively change any of this kind of content that I'm going to go through today, but it's worth keeping an eye out as further guidance is published by the ICO. And, if anything, I think it'll give us a little bit more clarity and flexibility on anonymization planning. I don't think it'll radically change what you have to do, what the end goal is. And it certainly doesn't change any of the key concepts that we're going to go through today. But I just wanted to point out this is something to keep an eye out for. Okay, so to begin with, we must emphasize that employing a three-prong approach that includes the anonymization of data, regulation of access to the data, and obtaining consent to share the data ensures not only a legal, but also an ethical kind of use of data and data sharing. So rather than just thinking about anonymization as something that you would do once, think about how it can affect all stages of research, including carefully considering the grounds for which you're processing the data and the information that you are providing participants. Think about anonymizing data files, and then consider the access to those files once they're ready to be shared. And all three aspects combine to form this kind of stronger ethical grounds to sharing data. So a few definitions to start with. What are we anonymizing exactly? According to the UK General Data Protection Regulation, this is the UK GDPR, and Data Protection Act, the DPA 2018, researchers must adhere to data protection requirements when managing or sharing personal data. And we've hyperlinked all the additional resources. So once the slides are made available, you can find even more additional information if you need to. So from the guidance that's published by the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, personal data is clearly defined within those policies as information that relates to an identified or an identifiable living person, be it directly or indirectly. This also includes information which can be gleaned from existing available sources. So if there's two things to stress with this definition. First, it's that personal data includes indirect identifiers as well as direct identifiers, and we're going to expand on both of those in a little bit. So this is not just simply names that you're looking for example. And second, this also includes piecing information together based on what's already available. So that could be an entirely other data sets or other publicly available information. We also have to think about special category data or sensitive personal data. Sensitive personal data, which is also known as special category data, is a specific set of special categories that must be treated with extra security. Again, this is defined within UK GDPR, but that includes, for example, racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data, health data, and data about a person's sex life or sex orientation. And finally, in the UK, we also have the Statistics and Registration Service Act. So this further builds on the definitions that we need to bear in mind and introduces the concept of personal information. So this is information relating to either a natural person or a body corporate. And the key difference is information about, a limited company or another legal entity does not constitute personal data and does not fall within the scope of UK GDPR. However, this information constitutes personal information and is subject to the Statistics and Registration Service Act considerations. Okay. So we've now covered, applicable legislation. So let's have a look at consent and participant communication. It is important to differentiate between consent from a legal view and consent from an ethical view. So consent can be used as one of the legal bases for processing personal data. However, most common basis for research conducted in the UK is going to be public task. And public task includes, all public bodies and authorities. So these are organizations that process data while carrying out tasks that are deemed to be in the public interest. So, for example, the NHS, universities, UKRI, and so on, all fall under public task. You can also process legitimate interest. So this is for all non-public bodies. So this might include like, charities, commercial companies, and so on. However, informed consent from an ethical perspective must always be considered no matter what kind of legal basis that you're using for processing the data. So always inform participants about your plans for collecting, using, and then sharing any data that's collected on them. So when I presented the three-prong approach, I mentioned access and control to the data. So best to put this in practice is the three-tier license and access framework that we use at the UK Data Service. So when you deposit data with the UK Data Service, we do license the collection under an appropriate access option. So we have different levels, including open, safeguarded, and controlled. So open data means that data can simply be downloaded from the data catalog without registration. And that would only be applied to data that's not considered personal data or personal information, or where there is consent, like explicit consent in place to share data like in that way. So for example, we do have a couple of collections from very public figures. So the consent procedure was very clear. There wasn't any point in kind of anonymizing that kind of data. So they had explicit consent to share it openly. For data where steps need to be taken so that the risk of identification is unlikely, so what the ICO would class as being effectively anonymized, that would be our safeguarded option. So this is where the data is treated and anonymization techniques have been applied accordingly. However, there's this extra safeguard that's put in place, and that's a legally binding end user license agreement between the UK Data Service and the user. So the agreement ensures that the data is used legally and ethically, and that secondary researchers understand their responsibilities when handling the data. And then finally, we offered a controlled option for any data which is considered sensitive or personal data or personal information. So access to that kind of data is supplied through the 5 Safes framework, which would require you to apply to access that data in a secure environment, only once you've undertaken specialized training, and where all of the outputs that you create from that data are then checked to ensure that there's no identifiable information being inadvertently released. So we've discussed a little bit about consent and access. We've seen an example of the access levels. So we can delve into identifiers now. So what are identifiers? Well, identifiability is simply being able to distinguish one person from the others. So often an individual's name together with some other information will be sufficient to be able to identify them. Identifiers can be classed in 2 groups, either direct, so information that directly identifies data subjects, and indirect. So this is information that in combination may uniquely identify data subjects. To note here is that this information can potentially be linked to other sources of data outside of the data set that you're using. So for example, you could use the electoral register to identify somebody. Okay, so before going into some examples, I do want to hear from you. So if you pop back to Menti, pop the code in. If you did shut it down, if you just pop the code back in. And I was hoping you'd be able to give us some examples of direct identifiers that you can think of. So what would be a direct identifier? So and remember, direct identifiers is information that directly relates to a specific individual. So you don't need other sources. Excellent. So we've got name, passport number, address, potentially date of birth, especially when you get into some of the more kind of like granular, like the actual day and month, potentially. Job title and company, yes, if that can be quite unique. Someone's just put ID numbers, which would include like, national insurance number, which is also on there. Someone's contact number, like their phone number, excellent. Their profession, depending on their profession. So some of these, you can start to see that actually it depends a little bit, maybe about the particulars, someone's particular institution. Well, if it's a really big institution versus a small one, that might matter potentially in thinking about identifiability. But yeah, absolutely. Someone's IP address, excellent. So these are all really good direct identifiers. So now give some examples of indirect identifiers. So these are things used in combination with other existing information that would then be able to identify somebody. We've got, let's see. Yes, so someone's physical appearance and their age and gender, race and ethnicity, year group in school, someone's religious beliefs, their family status, sexual orientation, geographic location, depending on how wide. So, for example, if it's something that's regional, mixed with their gender, mixed with their age, etc. Yeah, absolutely. So all of these are really good examples of indirect identifiers. Excellent. Fantastic. So I think um, so I've added here some common potential identifiers, direct identifiers, sorry, as well. So a key consideration is that what is often listed as a direct identifier, like a name, may easily identify a person. So, for example, some names, like John Smith, are a little bit more common than other names. So that might actually be considered an indirect identifier. Um, Other potential direct identifiers might link directly to that one individual, like their NHS number. So it's important, as I think some of you probably noted when you were typing these in and kind of thinking about it, it does depend a little bit on context and on the data itself. The UK GDPR makes it clear that other factors can identify an individual. So these include, and this is the quote from them, one or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of that natural person. So these sorts of characteristics can help to uniquely identify a particular individual as they tell you something about them. So if you're unsure about the information on whether it's not it's considered personal data, the ICO guidance states that you should treat it as if it's personal data. So part of the main reason behind that guidance is not just, out of precaution, but just to reiterate that information can become identifiable when it's combined with additional sources of information. So if you're unsure if something is personal data, then you need to be wary of the possibility that other information can make that data identifiable. The ICO provides in-depth information about personal data and guidance for de-identification and anonymization within that legal framework. We always like to make a clear distinction between these terms. So when we talk about de-identification of data, this refers to removing direct identifiers. This includes any identifiers that lead directly to the re-identification of individuals. So data remains, potentially identifiable indirectly. Anonymization, however, is the process of ensuring that the risk of identifying someone is negligible. This usually involves more than de-identification and will require further editing of indirect identifiers. Anonymization allows for the legal and ethical sharing of data while still preserving confidentiality. Effective anonymization is defined as neither personal data or personal information, and where the risk of identification is considered sufficiently remote. So effective anonymization is a really useful concept that the ICO has published about, where they say, it's been treated, it's been anonymized, and any kind of risk of re-identification is negligible. Might be theoretically, possible, but practically we are talking that this is very functional kind of anonymization. There is a relationship, however, between anonymization, data utility, or the ability to use the data for a range of purposes, access controls, or who can get a hold of that data, and information loss. So as data moves from personal data to anonymized data, the data utility goes down, the information loss goes up, but then more people can access it. So obviously, the original personal data would have the greater usage and the most information within it, but fewer people should be allowed to access that data. So how do we find the balance between these different aspects? Specifically, how can we maintain data utility while also anonymizing the data? And the ICO introduced this really useful concept in ensuring the utility of data, which is, as I mentioned before, effective anonymization. So there is more guidance, which is linked there, that helps you determine whether information qualifies as personal data or anonymous information, and how it's affected by the applicability of data protection laws. The assessment involves careful consideration of the risk of identifiability and the factors that are influencing it. With this concept comes several categories based on identifiable information to an individual, and they include, and this is kind of all linked within their spectrum of identifiability. So this includes directly identifiable data. So this is deemed to be personal data, indirectly identifiable data. So this falls under personal data, but the risk of identifiability is not sufficiently low yet. And then data unlikely to be identifiable, and the risk of identifying an individual in this particular category is considered sufficiently low. And then data that's impossible to identify. So this is, genuinely anonymous information. So again, if you want to see a kind of visual of that spectrum, the ICO guidance is linked on the bottom there. Data does exist as a spectrum, and having acknowledged this is what allows research to be able to continue, basically, and use this information within research. So here's an example of where you might need to continue to take additional factors into account when anonymizing. So we start out here with personal data, and you can simply take out the direct identifiers, which here is just the name. However, further contextual information might make you decide to change other information. So for example, I might mention that while Bakersfield Hospital does offer chemotherapy treatment, it's unusual perhaps to receive it there, as most in the area are sent to Churchill Hospital for their treatment. Alternatively, you might discover that Bakersfield Hospital specifically only does chemo treatment for certain types of cancer. Consequently, you might decide that it's an indirect identifier, especially with the date given for the treatment, so you want to change the name of the hospital and eliminate the specific dates of treatment too. Finally, the age of the participant is quite young for cancer treatment, which might make that information a little bit more identifiable. So consequently, this may also need to be changed. And here I've aggregated it to a higher level using ONS age categories, which could allow for, a relative understanding to national numbers. I should note here that when I put this slide together, I kept changing the slide several times over, debating what to change and how to change it. And I think this speaks to how anonymization is a little bit of an art, where there are a lot of decisions that need to be made. There are some decisions that I think might be a little bit easier than others to make. So it's important to keep in mind that those decisions are always contextual to your specific project and the specific needs of the data. So without further ado, let's investigate indirect identifiers in a little bit more detail. So the key message is that the context is of most importance. So when you're planning anonymization, the selection of indirect identifiers must be considered in relation to the subject of your data and the sample characteristics. So the following are not an exhaustive list of indirect identifiers, but they're, probably the most commonly found ones. And there's some considerations for each. So age, this is often considered to be one of the most important pieces of demographic information in data. It provides some precise insights into age-related trends and patterns, which are really critical for a lot of different types of analyses. So when handling age or date of birth information, it's crucial to consider various formats and the implications of each for privacy and data utility. The information can be presented in various formats, including, the full date of birth, the day of birth, the month of birth, the year of birth, the age as like a single age, or the age in months, or a banded age. So while detailed age data can enhance the quality of demographic analysis, it also increases the risk of identifying individuals where outliers are present or where information, in combination with other indirect identifiers, is a little bit unusual. It just kind of, narrows the pool of potential people that it could be. So anonymization techniques can render some numeric analyses, such as calculating the mean, impossible. So for example, if the ages are grouped into bands, the precise calculation of an average age is going to be less accurate. Therefore, it might be, better considered for a more detailed age information to be made available with additional techniques added to other variables, depending on the usage of the data, who has access to it, etc. Education information is just as common, and it's also of key importance to a wide range of research. So this could be presented as the highest level of education, the field of study, the duration of study, the type of institution. So like any other indirect identifier, care needs to be taken when detailed information is provided. This detailed information could be unique or only applicable to a small number of people in the population. So this type of information, especially when it's used in combination with other information that's been collected or made available, could lead to a re-identification of a participant. Where possible, education information should be categorized. You should try and use a coding frame. The usefulness of the information for secondary analysis should be considered with multiple versions of appropriate access made available where needed. So, for example, educational attainment or qualification level might be more useful than the specific institutional information. The ONS Census 2021 highest level of qualification codes could also be considered as a kind of standardized way of tracking education information. Employment information, be it occupation, classification, job title, sector, employment type, it's very similar to education information, and the same considerations have to be taken. Where very detailed information is made available, unique information that's only applicable to a small number of people in the population, you need to take those additional considerations. So as an example, a unique job title may result in a very easy identification, either when it's used in isolation or when it's used in combination with other information. So it's recommended that employment information is categorized and coded. So in the UK, we're lucky to have a standard schema known as the Standard Occupational Classification and the National Statistics Socioeconomic Classification. So this is SOC 2010, SOC 2020, and NSSEC coding frames that you can use to ensure some privacy. I have anonymized a qualitative data set from Affluent Worker where the specific job titles were used. And a lot of them, secretary or teacher, weren't particularly disclosive, but every once in a while we came across one of those job titles that was very, very specific. So it would have been, a football manager during these years. Again, that's just narrowing the pool of people it could possibly be. So it's important to keep in mind what kind of information is already out there you can find information about who is a football manager in a particular year. Um, and kind of adjust that accordingly. So what we ended up doing was use I believe it was the SOC 2010 at the time, the SOC 2010 Standard Occupational Classification System, and recoded that particular job title. Okay, onto income, which I believe was mentioned in the word cloud a little bit ago as an indirect identifier as well, and any other financial information, especially when there's unique outlying values that are being presented, that can easily lead to increasing the risk of re-identification. So a couple key examples here are either very high or very low income. And again, we're thinking of these when combined with other information. Or a more specific example could be providing information about a large lottery win that's recorded as unearned income. This may present an increased disclosure risk when it's being analyzed alongside other information that's available in the data, plus, any publicly information that might be available. So some lottery wins are quite well publicized. Financial information needs to be carefully checked and ensure that the level of detail provided doesn't compromise the identity of participants. Similar to age, some statistical analyses where individual numbers are required will not be possible. So data usability should always be considered as well when you are reclassifying income. We've got geographic information. So this is one of the most important indirect identifiers, but also most important information for secondary research. So this information can be varied based on countries or regions, or it could be postcodes. You could even have latitude and longitude recorded. So geographic or spatial variables that are present in the data should be considered very carefully. So detailed, low-level geographic variables will exponentially increase the ability to identify participants. So always consider the characteristics of the study, the sample size, and the individual data that you're anonymizing. So for example, in a politics-related study, low-level political geographies are of key importance for secondary analysis. So further anonymization can be applied to other indirect identifiers to try and help reduce the risk of re-identification. It's advisable that any geographic information, more detailed than regions, should have some more stringent access controls where that's required. And certainly if you're working with something like postcode, if something has a postcode, that would more likely be a data sets that we have in our controlled tier of access. Some postcodes are literally just 3 houses. So it's really important when you get to those more granular levels to really consider that. And we kind of, use the region as our threshold. Region is, okay, anything more detailed than that, definitely need to think about the access control to that. Similar to the date of birth information, exact dates of life events might also increase the risk of potential identification. So paying careful attention to life events is especially important, as some of this information is also available from open sources that could be used to identify a participant. So reducing exact dates to a month and a year might remove enough detail when considering other information that's available. In other cases, reducing the exact dates to the year only might be needed. So, as always, it's important to assess how important the information is to secondary research. So, changes that will decrease that data usability should require sort of increased or require increased access conditions. You might consider that alongside whether or not that granular information is needed. Detailed information about ethnicity, national identity, or religious affiliation can potentially be problematic when, again, used in combination with other variables. So detailed responses often include, what would be classed as a unique case. So using a standard coding frame is helpful, and the ONS does provide some guidance on that complex area, and that's also linked in these slides there. Similar to other identifiers, the context of data sharing and the usage for secondary research needs to be considered. So stricter access control can be utilized to provide a more detailed information if that's needed. And finally, a little bit more on sensitive information. So the previous examples, religious affiliation are also special category data under the data protection legislation in the UK. But as there are standard coding frames that can be used, this might not be as applicable to other types of sensitive data. So data should always be checked for sensitive information, any kind of special category data. Some information may include details that could be potentially harmful. So if a respondent is identified, such as they have a really unusual or sensitive health condition or status, or they provide details of illegal behavior, that type of information may need to be edited. But in doing so, it might also compromise the usability of the data. So more stringent access restriction might be considered instead, right? So it's always going to be a kind of balance between these in figuring out what is the best way forward. But where there is a kind of coding frame that you can use with that sensitive information, always consider whether or not that is something that could be applied to your particular data. So the key takeaway message here, when anonymizing data, the combination of information, the data utility, and the access to the information always needs to be considered. We're not simply editing one piece of information in isolation, but we're considering the entire context. So how do you anonymize? And this builds on, the exercise that we just had a little bit ago. We're proposing 3 steps as an approach to anonymization. So first, you need to find and assess the identifiers, and this includes considering what's a direct identifier and what's indirect, and then identifying any sensitive personal data as well. Once that's done, you can then implement the anonymization techniques, which I'm going to go through in just a moment. And then finally, you need to review the anonymized data. You need to reassess any of the remaining disclosure risk, and then apply any further anonymization as needed. So in that process, you will want to also consider what other data or information is available and how that might affect the identifiability of your data. Finally, checking your anonymization. The Office for National Statistics, the ONS, has written about an intruders test, which involves using individuals or friendly intruders to try and see if they can re-identify anonymized data. More and more data owners are now using the intruder testing as a final test to check whether or not their data has been anonymized or not. This is very similar to the kind of practices that we use at the UK Data Service when we're accepting data into our repository. So we will check the data to ensure that it's unlikely for participants to be identified. As a kind of ground rule for some of those checks, we do have that kind of listing of indirect identifiers that we keep an eye out for and look at what the context of the data is. And then we will have a go at trying to re-identify individuals, especially if the assessment of the identifiers kind of raise some concerns for us. If we are able to get close or we think there's potential there, it's something that we would then discuss with the data owner. So this kind of intruder testing is really useful. Okay, so just a quick Menti poll, make sure everyone is still with me. When we talk about something being effectively anonymized, which of the following examples would you say is effectively anonymized data? data where the risk of re-identification is negligible, password protected data, or data where the names have been replaced by pseudonyms. Okay, looks like the answers are slowing down. Excellent. So most of you got that. So it's the data where the risk of re-identification is negligible. Okay, so what are the actual techniques that we can use? So I'm going to go through anonymization techniques for both qualitative and quantitative data. They are similar, but sometimes the terminology that's used for the different type of data changes. So we've kept them as separate sections in the presentation for today, but I'm going to focus on quantitative data first. Okay, so once again, before making any changes to the data, remember that any changes should be made alongside data sharing plans to ensure that either over or under anonymization are avoided. So the most common methods for quantitative data are recoding, banding, top and bottom coding, and generalization. So I'll go through some examples of each of these. So let's look first at recoding. So this is also known as categorization. Disclosure risk partly lies in how many people can be recognized by a certain characteristic. So the fewer there are in a category, the more likely it is to identify a person. So recoding or categorizing means reducing the number of distinct categories of a characteristic. So rather than, for example, having more refined categories of ethnicity on the left, as you see, where there's, Black Caribbean, which is distinct from Black African. These are all combined under one category of just Black. So this helps reduce the precision. It raises the number of people that are classed as that, so it reduces the potential disclosure. A similar technique can be applied to continuous variables like age or income. So you can bin these by creating categories with a range. So on the left, for example, is the exact income. On the right, you can see these have been binned. It's worth noting that if you would want to compare your data to a national population, you may want to consider binning based on ONS categories. Sometimes, however, low frequency counts means that there's a greater risk of disclosure will only apply to certain groups within a variable or characteristic. So, for example, while age itself might not be problematic per se, it is if your age is over 100 because so few people globally make it to 100. So consequently, you can do what's called top and bottom coding by consolidating the categories at the extremes of your distribution. So here for age, you can see both 118 and 89 were coded as 80 plus. The remaining ages, which were less problematic, were just left as they were. And finally, you can also generalize. So this applies specifically to free text data or more qualitative data. So where the level of detail is provided that potentially makes it disclosive, you can simply edit that to reduce the level of detail. So for example, where someone here has said that they are leading the cybersecurity initiative, specifically focusing on blockchain technology security and data encryption techniques, very disclosive. You can just edit it to say that they were involved in IT security and data protection, which is a much broader area. Okay, so I'm going to look at some special considerations for qualitative data. So qualitative data, qualitative research, I should say in general, is based on verstehen, so understanding, and it often seeks these really rich, detailed information. And as such, it can be really difficult to decide what to anonymize and what to leave as is. So this detail is sometimes considered really important context for analysis. So anonymizing the data, especially if it's overdone, can compromise the integrity of the data very quickly. So some types of data, like audio and video, are direct identifiers in and of themselves. The sound of someone's voice and their image, their literal image, are types of personal data. Other types where you're just getting this rich, detailed information will contain so many indirect identifiers that it can be hard to decide what to change and how to change it, and how that is consistently applied throughout a collection. So I'm going to go through a few examples of some case studies to help you consider how you might manage the anonymization for your qualitative data. And the key with qualitative data, I think, is that you need to find this balance in anonymization. So within qualitative data, one of the most used types of qualitative data, at least judging by our archive, our collections, is transcript data. So we're going to have a look at anonymization techniques for transcript data. So firstly, any direct identifiers should be replaced with pseudonyms. And those pseudonyms are going to maintain the relationships within the data so that there's a greater readability to the text. So pseudonyms should be consistent throughout the project. You may also want to think about pseudonyms across collections. So for example, we get a lot who just will use in an interview transcript speaker tags which say interviewer and respondent. And they do that for every interview rather than looking across the collection. And what that does effectively is reduce the differentiation between speakers within a collection, which could potentially limit the analysis opportunities. So indirect identifiers are also going to be in that transcript data. We're going to talk about some of the strategies of categorization and generalization. Where there's an indirect identifier that's been identified, you can also replace that in the text. But again, you'll want to consider how that looks across the collection and whether or not that's being done consistently. Okay, so you can see some examples here on the slide. So categorization, it's the same thing essentially as we would do for quantitative data. This is where you create new categories that reduce the precision of the text. So generalization is less about creating categories and more about redescribing the text in broader terms. We also see generalization on a grander scale here, where, for example, transcripts are too disclosive, so interview summaries and field notes are provided instead. So sometimes we do get some data offers where people have some real valid concerns about the identifiability within interview transcripts. And in those cases, we have kind of said, have you thought about interview summaries instead? You have greater control over the kind of detail then that is released from those summaries. It does bring the usability down of those interviews, but it does also enable sharing of data. With consideration to transcript data specifically, there are some good practices coming up, including creating an anonymization plan from the start of the project. And then you can discuss that anonymization plans with participants. So this should outline some mandatory anonymization, which will be like, what are the direct identifiers that you're going to collect? And any other characteristics which you think are likely to lead to disclosure, such as specific towns or dates, or how you will treat the data. So are you going to give them a pseudonym? How is that going to be assigned? You should also outline potential anonymization. So this is anything that you think will come up in the data that you may need to keep a careful eye on, such as a mention of specific health conditions or discussion of court cases. Yeah, and anything, really got to consider the type of data that you're using, but anything that, broadly kind of covers these sorts of things, you want to make sure that you cross-reference and check, is this actually identifiable based on information that's already there? When you're making changes, you can use the find and replace function within any kind of word processing program. So make sure you know your options. Asterisks are often used as wildcards, so you can add that to the end of a verb to capture all of the conjugations, or the end of a noun to capture any kind of pluralization. Be sure to review each change rather than just hitting replace all. It takes time and can be a little bit more tedious, but I have read transcripts where words which contained the same letters in a row were unintentionally changed, which allowed for me to easily figure out what the original text was. So you want to be careful and check each one as it comes up. And then finally, make sure you identify changes. So sometimes this information can make a difference to the analysis. So it's important that reusers and yourself know where those changes have been made. So this is typically done with brackets, but you can also outline transcription guidelines to specify how you're going to annotate some of those changes. And here's just a quick example of what an anonymized transcript might look like. So you can see names, dates, and regions have been changed. Now, this is a really light touch anonymization. This is not overly done. This is also from a collection where retrospective consent was gathered from participants, so they were aware that the data was going to be archived. So it wasn't something that was planned from the start, but they did go back to get consent later. So that kind of three-prong approach comes back into this particular collection. For all this advice, however, you do have to keep your own project in mind. So, for example, the Pioneers of Social Research, which was conducted by Paul Thompson, where he did oral history interviews with leading social scientists, and that included extensive details about those participants' childhoods, what their educational background was, and what their careers were. It needed some special consideration. So, because of the relative fame of his participants, so these were leading sociologists, historians, anthropologists, they're very well published. They would be very well known within their disciplines. If I mention some of the names, some of you might already know people like, Stan Cohen, Mildred Blackster. Paul Thompson himself was interviewed, Ray Paul, one of his good friends. So some of these names we probably, if you've studied social sciences, you might recognize some of them anyways. So anonymization for this particular collection was a totally fruitless exercise, and was actually even problematic because it would potentially create disinformation, actually. So you needed to know who the identities were of these leading social scientists. So instead, what Paul Thompson did was seek explicit permission from his participants to use their names. So having said that, that doesn't mean that we just, didn't apply any kind of anonymization. We had a clear anonymization strategy in place. So when we were digitizing and reviewing those transcripts, we still looked for issues where participants talked about, for example, details of closed court cases, medical conditions of others who were not involved in the study. We also kept an eye out for reputational damage, so people saying things about others that might cause reputational damage. And we felt that those were clear ethical boundaries. Even though we had the consent in place that covered the legal use of their personal data, we still had this kind of other layer of ethical considerations, and that is what supported our anonymization plan for this particular project. Image and audio data are particularly difficult to work with as the data itself is personal data. So I think I said this before, but a person's image, and often the uniqueness of voices makes it identifiable already. So the best strategy for dealing with this kind of data is to ensure that any processing is done with consent. It is possible to try blurring images, or there's a technique called revoicing transcripts, where you might have some headphones on and you're just repeating exactly everything that is said. So you revoiced it in your own voice. But there does come a point where you have to wonder if that depletes the value of the data too much. So for example, what is the point of supplying an image if the image is largely blurred out? So instead, we recommend to ensure there's clear consent to publish and use the data where you want to. Also be aware of identifying context. So it might be specific jewelry or tattoos or backgrounds that might more easily identify someone. And if you are going to try and use any kind of software to anonymize that kind of data, make sure you're using software that operates locally. So for example, I think GIMP is an open source tool, and Audacity for audio is open source as well. So that just means that you download them and you're using them on your computer specifically. You're not sending it, for example, across the web. And importantly, you need to double check that you can't undo the anonymization. So if you've tried blurring an image, for example, try to resharpen it to see if it's been blurred enough, to see if that you can't go back basically on those edits that you've made. Okay, so we've got just a few more Menti questions for you. So which of the following techniques are appropriate for anonymizing transcript data? So we've got direct identifiers with pseudonyms, categorization of indirect identifiers, and generalization of indirect identifiers. Oh, excellent. Everyone seems to be answering the same. Excellent. Yeah, all of those can be used with transcript data. Now, thinking about continuous variables. Recoding, banding, or generalization for continuous variables. Excellent. We've got most people going for banding there. I've just said continuous variables. I suppose if you think about it, there might be ways of applying generalization or recoding, but generally we normally think of banding with continuous. And then finally, when considering data sharing, what are the main approaches to ensuring participants are protected? That you have consent to process the data, that you've anonymized the data, or that you've regulated access control, or all three of these. And again, everyone's kind of coming in with that last one. Yeah, our three-prong approach. Make sure you have consent in place. And, even if you are using public task as a legal basis for processing that data, that consent is an ethical kind of consideration that will guide some of your decisions on what you do with that data. And that you have a clear anonymization strategy for the data, and that you regulate the access where needed. Okay, so we are kind of winding up here, and we still have quite a bit of time to go through any questions that might have come up. I did see there's quite a lot going on in the chat and some questions that have come in. So I'll look at those in just a minute. I just wanted to wrap up with a few points here. So we've got some further resources if you're interested. All of these slides are going to be available on our events page after the session. So feel free to download those and click through if you're interested. But we do have some Learning Hub pages on anonymizing data. We've also got an interactive crash course on de-identifying and anonymizing transcript data and numerical data. You might also be interested in the ONS policy for social survey microdata or the CESDA data management expert guide. And there are some useful semi-automated tools out there. So any kind of tool that you use for anonymization is always going to have some element where you will need to very carefully assess and review what's been done. I think a lot of people use SDC Micro for numerical data, for quantitative data. We also have a tool called QA My Data, which kind of gives you a health check on your numeric data. It kind of scans the data and flags things for you and kind of gives you an overall score that you can use to think about whether or not your data needs more treatment. There are a couple of others listed there as well. We do also have a couple of tools for qualitative data, but there's not as many good tools for qualitative data. So QualiAnon is an open source tool that's developed by the Quali service at University of Bremen. And that is a manual tool. It's kind of, I think it's probably best described as it kind of helps you organize and think about and consistently apply your anonymization strategy. It doesn't do the anonymization for you per se. It's still a manual tool, but it is something to help you organize and apply your anonymization strategy consistently. We also have a text anonymization helper tool. So this is a word macro for transcript data, and it basically just flags things that are likely to be disclosive. So it will identify things like numbers and capital letters. And then, if you've got like locations or ages or something, it'll flag those for you. It'll highlight them so that you can see them. So again, it's a tool to help you kind of apply your anonymization strategy. There is also a new tool on the market called Microsoft Presidio, which is a kind of terminal-based program that you can use. We're still in the process of kind of exploring Presidio and how effective it is. There have been some good reviews back about it. Some of the early predecessors to Presidio, like TextWash, for example, I think were probably more proof of concept than actual usable tools. Presidio is probably the most usable tool in terms of actually doing a little bit of the anonymization for you. So scanning the data to identify potentially disclosive, and then you can put in what pseudonyms that you want to replace. So Presidio may be an option, but it is a terminal based. I think there were plans to make a user interface for it, but I'm not sure that that has come to fruition quite yet. It is a very new tool still. Okay. And finally, I know some of you might have some questions about where increasingly powerful AI programs might be impacting anonymization. And first, I think it's important to remember that anonymization itself is a form of data processing, which means that it's fully covered by the UK GDPR and Data Protection Act. So even when your end goal is to anonymize, you still need a lawful basis for doing so, and you still have to follow the principles of, purpose limitation, data minimization, security. Also, organizations must have appropriate technical and organizational measures in place. So things like secure storage, controlled access, encryption, or tools for encryption, and documenting those processes. So you need to be aware of, for example, where your data is going to be stored. And many AI programs might be sending data elsewhere. So it's important to be aware of what's allowed. Many universities are offering some guidance on this. So I have seen that some universities have like these tables where they list a kind of AI powered program, and whether or not it's approved and what considerations to make and so on. I think Copilot Enterprise has some level of security clearance that allows you to use it with certain types of data, but I would limit the usage of those programs to something that can work locally, so that you're not sending data out elsewhere using an AI program. So all of the tools that are mentioned on this page are all ones that can work locally. Oops, sorry. Researchers are also expected to maintain detailed records. So that includes things like risk assessments. So you might have to fill in a DPIA. And if you are planning on using any kind of AI powered program, you'll want to make sure this is mentioned in your DPIA, your data protection impact assessments. And you'll need some clear documentation as to how anonymization was carried out. And this is essential for accountability. So where AI is being used, make sure it's detailed in any of that documentation. And then finally, with developments in AI, we also need to be aware that advanced systems can sometimes reconstruct or infer identities from data that was assumed to be anonymous. So especially when you're combining it with other data sets. And this is why we rely on, our three-prong approach to data sharing. So making sure that there's the consent of participants, exploring, access controls, and making sure there's a clear anonymization plan in place. But as part of all of that, you want to make sure, that you are thoroughly checking and reviewing all of these processes. So things like the intruder test, I think, are really useful. So overall, anonymization is still crucial, and it's probably going to be done at least partly manually. But AI I think makes it even more important than ever to treat it as a careful and accountable process rather than just this technical step that you do once along the research process. Okay, so I have one last question for you on Menti, which is how are you feeling now about your understanding of anonymization? So hopefully this has kind of helped raise some of your confidence. Um, and if these are terms that you've heard before, hopefully you've just had a little bit of a reinforcement of what it is you're looking for. Um, and this is good. It looks like there might be some movement here on confidence, which is good to hear. There is one last thing. So just to strike down your confidence, one last thing to cover. So now that you're feeling more confident, I think we need to look at some of the potential upcoming changes. So data protection is a changing landscape. And I think we just have to accept that. So just when you start to feel confident is when everything starts to change again. But there's a few things to keep an eye out for with our newest legislation, which is the Data Use and Access Act 2025, the DUAA. So there is some final guidance that's going to be published. So I was looking at trying to look for this guidance last week, thinking, oh, maybe there's something out there. And it said it was going to be published in autumn winter 2025. And I just double checked this morning to make sure it didn't get published over the weekend or something like that. You know how the government works, sometimes it does that. And it changed to winter 2025, 2026. So it's actually the guidance is being pushed back a little bit anyways. But I think there's a few things that we want, once we do have that final guidance, a few things to keep an eye on. And one is that there may be more clarification on what counts as research data. And this is important because research gets special allowances under data protection law since it is seen as a public good. So the DUAA is clarifying and potentially widening what falls into that category. So they list, for example, that genealogical research falls under historical research, which is good to know. So it just is possibly going to clarify what is scientific data. So depending on your area of research, this could offer some clarity for you. The act is also going to permit the use of broad or future consent for research where it's not possible to specify every future use at the time of collection, which is, of course, great news for those who are seeking consent for archiving data. So bear in mind that your ethics boards may still expect clarity and transparency from you, but the legal basis seems like it might be widening a bit. So we need to keep an eye on what this would apply to. It seems to apply primarily to the context of scientific research, but guidance is hopefully going to help clarify the bounds of that and give us more idea about how we can use some of these other consent models and how we might balance them against the expectation of our ethics boards. There's also going to be a new lawful basis of recognized legitimate interest. Now, normally, I think the vast majority of research that data collections that we get in are processed under public task. But I know there are cases that have been made at other archives and by specific project groups to process it under legitimate interest. So some forms of research might benefit from the new basis if they fall under this category. I don't know what the specific examples are of this. I expect the guidance will have a little bit more information within it, but there's a new lawful basis which might be of interest. Under the Act, anonymization is judged by whether an organization that is processing the data could reasonably identify a person. And this shifts from an absolute standard of no one on earth could ever identify them to one that I think is a little bit more contextual. And this is where I think the guidance, when it comes out, will be really, really important to think about and apply to anonymization strategies because it will help us ascertain what level of anonymity is necessary. So the ICO has always recommended effective anonymization, but this act is demonstrating that there are changes around the use of personal data, which seem to really emphasize that effective anonymization. So the DUAA seems that it's going to make the task of anonymization perhaps a little bit more realistic. So we're possibly not chasing this kind of theoretical grand idea of anonymization and absolute anonymity, but a more practical one, which I think is an encouraging change. I don't think it necessarily changes any of our anonymization techniques or what we're aiming for, but it will just continue to emphasize that we're looking for this effective anonymization, this kind of functional and practical approach to anonymization. You can read more about the updates on the ICO's pages. These updates, as they're written out, apply to all, not just to researchers, but you will find that they do mention research data specifically where it's applicable. So I'm hoping when we run this session again in the spring, summer, that guidance will be published and we can fully incorporate that. I'm not anticipating huge dramatic changes to anything, but this does change perhaps, the parameters of anonymization and, how we support them, how we underpin it by legislation. And so I think this framework is, if anything, just going to make it a little bit more digestible, the task of anonymization, just a little bit more digestible. So keep your eye out on that. No changes as of yet, but we'll see what the guidance says. Okay. So I'm just rounding off here. If you do want to get connected with us, we are on X, we're on Blue Sky, we're on LinkedIn. We've got a JISC mail list if you want to see what collections we have published that week, that sort of thing. Join our JISC mail list. And then we also have the YouTube channel. So we've got a few minutes left here just to look at some of these questions that are coming up. If you do have questions that arise, just a reminder to check back in on our Padlet. And I'm going to put together a document that tries to answer all of those. If it's a question that I can't answer, I'll find someone at the archive who is able to answer it, and we'll get those back to you within the week. So that we can, it'll get published alongside the slides and the recording. So give me a moment while I just have a look at these questions that have come up. Okay, I think that's all I have time for. I hope that was useful and clear enough. I will check back at the Padlet. I'll leave it open for another couple of days before closing it down, and we'll collate all of the questions from both the chat, the Q&A, and the Padlet. And so if I didn't get to your question, I'm really sorry. I will definitely write up a response to that. So do check back on the web pages. And good luck with your anonymization. If you have any questions or you want to chat anything through, or if you're looking at depositing your data and you just need some clarity or assurance, please always feel free to get in touch with us. Okay, thank you all. And thank you, Emma, for your help today as well, facilitating.